Hello, I'm Reverend Phillip Shanker, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our introductory lecture series on the divine principle. Based upon our understanding of God's unchanging and eternal ideal for the creation and the tragedy of the human fall and humanity's separation from His will, we've been studying the process and providence of restoration, how a loving, wise, and almighty God has been working behind the events of human history to establish the foundation for the Messiah and the realization of His original plan and purpose. We've seen in the parallels of history the invisible hand of a mighty God working behind human events. And as we come toward our concluding presentations, we are getting closer and closer to our own age and time and the ability to understand how God is working now. Let us look at the events of the 20th century on the foundation of our historical understanding and understand the purpose and providence behind the three great world conflicts that took place in the 20th century. Join me. The world wars. When Jesus spoke of the signs of the end of the world and the beginning of a new world in Matthew, the 24th chapter, He predicted that global war would be taking place as a sign of the end of this false history. He said, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, for nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom." Now, in what sense did Jesus understand the future? Did He look into the future and see Hitler and Germany and Japan and the various nations arising? Or did Jesus understand the providence of God and that the original separation of good and evil in the heart and mind of our first ancestors that manifested in the struggle between brothers, Cain and Abel, that struggle would manifest to the family, the tribe, the nation, and finally the world, necessitating a final struggle between God and Satan to retain sovereignty on earth? Let's consider the significance of the world wars, the providential causes of the world wars. Now, from an external standpoint, wars break out due to such factors as conflicts of political or economic interests, struggles over land or people or sovereignty, and clashes of ideology. Yet these are merely external causes. There are also internal causes of wars that are connected to the providence of restoration. What are these internal, providential causes of world wars? First, world wars have resulted from Satan's last desperate struggle to preserve his sovereignty. This is the reason why the Bible maintains that prior to the coming of Christ, the Antichrist will come. Satan, who struggles to retain control and dominion, who sees God working according to the principle to advance His providence, struggles to establish. Evil is in the subjective and dominant position, and evil always strikes first. Secondly, the three world wars have occurred in order to fulfill a worldwide indemnity condition to restore the three great blessings. Humanity is to realize the kingdom of heaven by fulfilling the three blessings. Therefore, a condition to indemnify the false tradition and the lack of these three blessings is a foundation for that fulfillment. Thirdly, the three world wars have occurred so that all humanity can inherit Jesus' foundation, overcoming on the worldwide level the three temptations by which Satan tempted Jesus. Now you remember that those three temptations were also conditions for Jesus to restore the three blessings. And fourthly, it's a condition for God's sovereignty. If the wars successfully overcome Satan's attempt to retain sovereignty, successfully lay a foundation for the three blessings, and to inherit Jesus' victory in the three temptations, then on that foundation, God can advance the providence and increase His sovereignty, authority, and control in the world. So the world wars have taken place to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition to restore God's sovereignty. Let's look then at the First World War from this providential point of view. Now, in the political sphere, the First World War was a conflict between Abel-type democracies, Christian democracies which pursued the goal of the providence of restoration, the spreading of rights, justice, and freedom, the respect for the religious rights and the spirituality of the individual, creating an environment where God could advance his providence and send the Messiah. So a struggle between these able-type democracies and authoritarian states where more Cain-type democratic ideals were thriving. In the sphere of religion and ideology, the Cain-type nations in this first conflict included Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim nation which was controlling the Middle East and persecuting Christianity, and its allies, Germany and Austria-Hungary. They fought the able-type nations of Great Britain, the United States, France, and Russia, which generally upheld Christianity. These were Christian nations. Now, the question of which nations are on God's side and which are on Satan's side is decided based on the direction of God's providence of restoration. Those who are in line with the direction of God's providence or acting in concert with that direction, even indirectly, are on the side of God, while those who take an opposing position are on the side of Satan. So in other words, to place a nation in the position of Abel or Cain, representing God's providential work to restore the kingdom, or Satan's effort to stop the advance of that kingdom, is not decided based on whether France has more good people than Germany, or whether Russia's heritage and history is a better one than Austria-Hungary. It's based upon the ideology and the political movement, whether it can serve the advance of God's providence. So what serves God's providence? Christian democracy. The ideals of Christianity as a foundation for rights, freedom, justice, and belief in God. And the democratic foundation to restore an environment where the Messiah can come and be respected and received. Therefore, nations that oppose that can be used as an instrument of Satan's side. Now, let's then consider the role of each of these powers and the positions they took. In the First World War, the Allied powers, led by Great Britain, the United States, France, and Russia, were Christian nations. Moreover, they had been fighting to liberate Christians who were under the persecution in Turkey. Thus, they stood on God's side. Now, let's be clear. United States, Great Britain, and France were Christian democracies, and thus they could stand in the position of being used as instruments of God's providence. Now, Russia began this period as a Christian nation, but its political system was a corrupt and rather despotic Tsarist monarchy. Therefore, it is for this reason that Russia could not stand in that position and was ultimately invaded through the revolution which brought down the Tsarist leadership and established communism. Now, communism as an atheist and materialist ideology that opposes the development of spiritual life and belief in God could not then allow this nation to stand as an able nation in the providence. So the year in which the revolution took place and Russia became the first communist nation, you can see that the leadership immediately began to negotiate a peace treaty with Germany and pull out of the war. And it was in the same year, 1917, that the United States reluctantly entered the war. So in this way, there were never more than three nations. First, at the beginning of the war, Russia and Great Britain and France. And by the end of the war, the Allies, the Allied powers, were based on the three Christian democracies of the U.S., Great Britain, and France. You'll see a reason why three nations on God's side stood opposing three nations of the Central Powers representing Satan's side. The significance of three nations and these positions will be discussed in a moment. So now Germany, Austria-Hungary, the leading Central Powers, supported Turkey, a Muslim nation which was persecuting Christianity. Therefore, together with Turkey, they stood on Satan's side. Now, in addition to the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany was under the leadership of Kaiser Wilhelm. Now, Kaiser is the German word for Caesar, and Wilhelm did have ambitions of creating a global empire, pan-Germanism, world hegemony, and had set himself up as a model or ideal man, in a way, an imitation of the first blessing. Now, if the Central Powers had been successful in World War I, without question, the providence of God centered on the advance of Christian democracy and freedom and rights and justice in the world would have been impeded. What were the internal causes of this first global conflict? First of all, the war had to take place to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition to restore God's three great blessings at the formation stage. There should appear, at the end of fallen history, an unprincipled world which has realized a distorted outward form of the three blessings at the formation stage, an attempt by the sovereignty of evil to establish control and retain it in advance of God's providence. This is the significance of the rise of the Kaiser, his goal of pan-Germanism, and his desire for world hegemony, which would have blocked the advancement of God's providence. Now, God's side should then prevail over this unprincipled attempt to fulfill this global indemnity condition. Now, second, the First World War took place in order to have people on God's side collectively overcome Jesus' first temptation on the worldwide level. By prevailing in his first temptation in the wilderness, Jesus was able to recover the foundation to restore the perfection of his character. You remember that Satan tempted him after 40 days of fasting and hunger that he should turn stones into bread in order to satisfy his hunger. Jesus maintained the position of his mind and spirit over his body and said, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God," restoring the basis for individual spiritual maturity and the first blessing. Likewise, by prevailing then in the First World War, God's side laid the foundation for Christ's return. This was the basis for Christ to be born and grow to perfect his own individual character. Now, the third providential cause of the First World War took place in order to lay the formation stage foundation for the restoration of God's sovereignty. Democracy, which arose as the final political system to pave the way for God's ideal, with the mission to restore God's sovereignty. In the First World War, God's side was to be victorious and expand the democratic world. Now, this was to take place through the establishment of a global organization where the interests of every sovereign state was represented in a democratic process. This was to be the League of Nations. And secondly, the effort of the victors in the conflict, the allies, to rebuild the vanquished foes and bring them into the community of democratic nations. However, both of these efforts fell short and failed. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson said that the purpose of World War I was to make the world safe for democracy. At the close of the war, Wilson came to the Treaty of Versailles with a 14-point plan for how to reshape the world as a democratic world, which would have been a foundation for God's providence for the future. The two most important aspects of Wilson's 14 points were, number one, the creation of a global democratic institution, the League of Nations, which all nations would participate in and guarantee the democratic process. Secondly, he proposed that the victors in the conflict of World War I would forgive the Central Powers, would invest in the Central Powers and raise them into the community of democratic nations. But what happened? The European allies resisted the idea of forgiving and rebuilding the vanquished foes. Now, in the past, the tradition of war was always that where to the victor go the spoils. When someone won in a war, they would normally dominate. They would extract funds or make slaves of their vanquished enemies. But in this modern era, this proposal of serving and raising up the vanquished foe would have been a foundation of substance. The unity of Abel loving and serving Cain and raising him up, and would have been an important condition for the establishment of God's providence in the free world. The European allies resisted. England, and particularly France, where much of the war had been fought, had suffered greatly during the period of World War I and paid a dear price. So instead, they wanted to punish the vanquished foe, and they put a huge and heavy war debt on the nation of Germany, for example. And the 1920s, the aftermath of World War I, was a tremendous struggle as Germany's economy went reeling and sank, and Germans were frustrated and struggling. It was in the midst of that situation that a leader arose who appealed. His name was Adolf Hitler. He appealed to German national pride, the injustice of the situation, the struggle that they'd been through, and the possibility of restoring German dominance, and thus was able to ride the wave of struggle and resentment to power and establish the Nazi leadership in Germany. This was a tragedy. Then what about the League of Nations? Well, the Treaty of Versailles approved the League of Nations, but when President Wilson returned home, the U.S. Congress, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, the head of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, opposed the idea, didn't want to get involved, and so America rejected membership in the League of Nations, which soon became irrelevant and fell apart. America then turned toward itself, and with an isolationist policy focused on its own material development, its own good life. And the Roaring Twenties arose, which at the end, the stock market crashed and America entered into the Great Depression. And so this effort to advance global democracy fell short after World War I. Winston Churchill, analyzing the rise of Hitler and Germany and the beginning of World War II in his series on the Second World War, said that World War II began at the Treaty of Versailles and the failure of the Allies to serve and embrace Germany at that time. Let's consider then the providential causes of the First World War. With the defeat of the satanic world and its ruler, the Kaiser, the world on God's side won the formation stage victory and laid the foundation then for the birth of the returning Christ, who is destined to be the Lord of God's world. So this 2,000-year period of Christianity had become the foundation for Christ's return. And with the global victory, this formation stage victory of World War I, the way was paved for the Messiah to be born. Let's now consider the Second World War, a summary of the providence of this war. In the Second World War, democracy, while standing upon the formation stage victory attained in the First World War, defeated fascism and secured victory at the growth stage. Let's consider the nature of fascism. Fascism, of course, denies the fundamental values of modern democracy, including respect for the individual and his basic rights, freedoms of speech, the press and association, and the parliamentary system. Thus, it's obviously an instrument of Satan's side, which can block the advance of the democratic ideal as a foundation for the kingdom. Now let's consider then the providential roles of the various nations that represented God's side and Satan's side. At the very beginning of history, in the Garden of Eden, it was due to the false relationship of three individuals that Satan established a false world. The fall of Adam, Eve, and the archangel became the basis that God's three great blessings were not realized. These three individuals united in a false way and became the basis for a fallen history. Therefore, in the restoration of the three blessings, there necessarily have to be three actors taking these respective roles. Now, in the garden, on the family level, it was three individuals. But now on the world stage, three nations take these positions. So during the Second World War, three nations on God's side represented Adam, Eve, and the archangel as a foundation for God's providence and advancing his will. They led the fight against three nations on Satan's side, which also represented Adam, Eve, and the archangel. Now, the victory of the nations on God's side would make a growth stage indemnity condition for the restoration of the three great blessings. Satan, who was aware of this providence, took the lead by mustering the three nations representing Adam, Eve, and the archangel on his side and had them attack the three nations on God's side. Remember, Satan is in an aggressive, dominant position, and the principle of Antichrist refers to the fact that Satan will always work in advance of God's providence to retain his sovereignty. And so World War II, like World War I, arose because Satan's side attacked first. Let's consider these providential nations. The United States as a masculine type of nation and the initiating or subjective force of the Allies represented Adam on God's side. Great Britain as a feminine type of nation represented Eve on God's side. France, in a supporting role and as a mixed type of nation, represented the archangel on God's side. Now, on Satan's side, Germany, which was in the dominant and aggressive leadership position, and as a masculine type of nation, represented Adam's position. Japan, in an objective role, and as a feminine type of nation, represented Eve. And Italy, in a supportive role, as a mixed type of nation, represented the archangel. Now, in the First World War, we can similarly see that the United States, Britain, and France had represented God's side. At the same time, it was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey that had taken these positions on Satan's side. But there's one historical puzzle here. The Soviet Union, which was a nation now clearly on Satan's side, participated in the Second World War as part of the Allies, on God's side. Now, how was that possible providentially? When the prevailing social order obstructs the formation of new societies, including those that would further Satan's goals, then you'll see even cooperation between Satan's side and God's side to destroy it. In this way, the Soviet Union in the Second World War joined forces with the nations on God's side to destroy fascism in order that it might quickly advance and build up a communist empire, the communist world. Consider how that was done. Actually, the Soviet Union under Stalin made a secret deal with Hitler prior to World War II, the division of Poland, which helped to initiate World War II. And at the end of the war, the only nation that actually was a victor, expanded its territory and got result, was the USSR, which could quickly expand on the foundation of the treaties after World War II. In this way, we could see how the Soviet Union used this opportunity to expand the foundation for global communism. Now let's then consider the providential causes behind this Second World War. First, the war broke out to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition at the growth stage to restore God's three great blessings. Again, at the consummation of history, there will surely emerge an unprincipled world which is realized to establish a false ideal, retain control of the world, and block the advance of God's providence. This is the significance of the arising of Hitler, who saw himself in many ways in a position like Jesus. Copies of the Bible in Germany replaced with Mein Kampf, My Struggle, his own biographical, and also his focus upon the expansion of the master race, the Germanic people, and his goal of world conquest. This was Satan's second attempt. Now, God's side should prevail over this unprincipled attempt by fulfilling this worldwide indemnity condition at the growth stage. So the second providential cause behind the war was to have people on God's side overcome Jesus' second temptation on the global level, inheriting that foundation. Remember that by overcoming the second temptation in the wilderness, Jesus laid the foundation for multiplication, the second blessing, the restoration of children. Likewise, in the Second World War, God's side had to prevail to fulfill the indemnity condition to restore worldwide God's second blessing. This became the foundation for the Messiah to fulfill the second blessing and also to begin to multiply children spiritually through his public ministry. The third providential cause behind the war was to lay the growth stage foundation for the restoration of God's sovereignty. Once again, having overcome Satan's second attempt to retain sovereignty and laid the foundation to restore the three great blessings at the growth stage, now God's providence could advance and the foundation for a Christian, God-centered, democratic world could advance. This took place through the establishment of the United Nations, which restored the failure of the League of Nations. It's an interesting side note that Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who was one of the strongest supporters of the United Nations and became one of the early U.S. ambassadors to the United Nations, was the grandson of the very man who had opposed America's involvement in the League of Nations, his grandfather, Henry Cabot Lodge. In addition, the Allies also accomplished what the Allies had failed to do after World War I. They turned toward their vanquished enemies, Germany, Japan, and Italy, and invested in them and raised them into the community of democratic nations, establishing them as some of the strongest allies in the current democratic world. Now let's consider the providential results of the Second World War. The age for building a new heaven and a new earth under the leadership of Christ at the Second Advent had now begun as the ministry began to advance. That's why throughout the world many Christians began receiving revelations concerning the return of Christ, and God's spiritual works began occurring throughout the world. Now let's consider the Third World War. The divine principle was written in the midst of the 20th century. That's when it was first written down. And now, after many years have passed, we can see its prophetic insight. We're going to present what was written down in 1958 in the first volume of the Principle, and its discussion of the coming Third World War and the world to follow, to see how powerfully it recognized and revealed the process of God's providence. Is the Third World War inevitable? At the consummation of human history, Satan's side and God's side will struggle, until each one can attain sovereignty over the world. That's their competing desire. This is why the democratic world and the communist world stood confronting each other at the latter part of the 20th century as a result of this providential struggle. Consequently, it became inevitable that there would be wars. First to divide the world, and then ultimately unify these two worlds. The First and Second World Wars had the providential purpose of dividing the globe into democratic world and communist worlds. At the close of World War II, the world rapidly divided into two camps, and every nation was either part of one or the other, or a third world nation which was forced to ally with one or the other side. Afterward, another third conflict must take place according to the principle to bring about the unification of these two worlds and the foundation for the kingdom of God. This conflict is the Third World War. Now, from the view of the principle, it was inevitable that that Third World War would take place. However, there were two possible ways it could be fought, and this was discussed in 1958 when the principle was written down. In other words, the providence of God's will to establish a third world conflict was absolute, beyond human influence. But how it was going to take place was depending upon the actions of men, human responsibility. One way to bring Satan's side to surrender is through armed conflict. However, the ideal world can never be built merely by defeating enemies in battle. After such conflict, they must be brought to submission internally through love and service and investment, so that everyone can be reconciled and rejoice sincerely from the bottom of their hearts. After World War I, the democratic world couldn't advance simply by the defeat of the Central Powers. There had to be this condition of rebuilding that would have made it advance. That was the key to the advance of democracy after World War II from the principle's point of view. So, the other way, however, that this war could be fought is a wholly internal and ideological conflict without the outbreak of armed hostilities. By which of these two ways will the Third World War actually be fought? It depends upon the success or failure in carrying out the human portion of responsibility. This, the prediction of the principle at that time. Now, the summary of the providence of the Third World War. The Third World War was to be the final global conflict in the providence of restoration. Now, in fact, even though it was primarily a Cold War, the regime of communism around the world caused more death and bloodshed and human suffering than both World War I and World War II combined. 35 or 40 million died in Russia under Stalin. Perhaps 60 to 100 million died in China under Mao Zedong. The tragedy in Cambodia and elsewhere around the world. However, the second summary of the providence of the Third World War, through this war, God's goal was that the democratic world would bring the communist world to submission and build, therefore, the ideal world. During the Third World War, God's side is to found the perfect Abel-type view of life, based upon a new truth, a third reformation, a spiritual renewal in the free and democratic world, and establish the completion stage level of world democracy. So it's not enough that the communist world was overcome and the Cold War was ended. Now, in the free and democratic world, a spiritual renewal is absolutely necessary. Consider the United Nations, which was founded as an instrument to advance the providence of democracy and pave the way for God's kingdom, has become ineffectual as a tool of peacemaking, struggling, racked by scandal, although supporting worthy and humanitarian causes, also dominated by national self-interest and many other problems, and it's been ineffective in expanding the foundation for peacemaking in the world. Meantime, we see the narrow-minded and fundamentalist members of the world's faiths are confronting each other. Terrorism and global conflict for those who want to articulate only their own narrow religious view. This leads some to conclude that there will be an inevitable clash of civilizations. And then look at the free world, the decline of morality, the breakdown of the family, confusion in our value systems, the struggle and difficulty of young people, and all that's taking place. This can only be solved through a new, third, spiritual renewal, religious reformation through the new truth, to strengthen the family, to clarify the foundation of morality, ethics, and value, to lift religious leadership beyond their own narrow sectarian interests and see a global view, the universal values which are being pursued by all humanity, to renew the United Nations. And you will see that those who understand the divine principle and who are working, representing its goals and interests, are doing just that, working for renewal at the United Nations, working for interreligious dialogue and harmony, working to bring peace in the Middle East through reconciliation, dialogue, and understanding, working to rebuild and bring blessing to the family and lift up young people in the world. This is the direction that must be taken now as a result after the Third World conflict. God's side must then guide all humanity into one unified world. So the providential causes behind this Third World War: first, the war had to take place to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition at the completion stage to restore God's three great blessings. At the consummation of human history, there would absolutely emerge an unprincipled world with the pretense of having restored the three great blessings at the third stage level. Satan's third attempt to retain sovereignty. This was the mission of communism in the 20th century, and the significance of the rise of Stalin and his effort to build Soviet imperialism, a Soviet empire, and world communism. By prevailing over the satanic world, God's side is responsible to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition at the completion stage, to restore the world of the three blessings centered upon God. Second, the Third World War has to take place to have people on God's side overcome Jesus' third temptation on the world level. Remember, by overcoming the third temptation in the wilderness, Jesus established the foundation to restore dominion over creation. He resisted Satan's offer for control over the kingdoms of the world, restoring the basis for a godly dominion. Likewise, in the Third World War, God's side must win to restore all humanity's dominion over the entire universe. This will be realized through the sovereignty and success of God's third Adam, the Messiah. Then, thirdly, the Third World War has to take place to lay the completion stage foundation for the restoration of God's sovereignty. Satan's three attempts to retain dominion have been vanquished. The foundation for the three blessings and Jesus' three temptations to be restored has been made. Now God can advance his sovereignty and realize the kingdom. God's side must be victorious in this conflict, destroy the communist world, and return all sovereignty to God. The providential results of the Third World War: God intends to restore through indemnity the entire providence, which was prolonged to this third stage, by winning victory in all three of these world conflicts, which belong to the final chapter of providential history. The providence of restoration can be completed only after fallen people restore their heart toward God through God's life-giving word and inherit God's lineage. The victories of God's side in these 3 world wars will make possible the realization of God's ideal world, for which he has labored with unremitting tears over the centuries of human misery. We have been able to see at the close of the 20th century the end of communism, the foundation for the realization of God's ideal. In our final presentation, we will look at the second coming of the Messiah, the return of Christ, and answer the question, how is God working in our own age and time? Thank you for your kind attention. God bless.